For the month of January this year, our sermons are going to focus on the concept of peace. The word or the concept of peace has several definitions, several different layers of meaning, but today we're going to focus on inner peace, on peace as freedom from disturbance, as freedom from anxiety, as quiet, as tranquility, as calmness. Our peace of mind is important, and it's also an indicator of our spiritual maturity. Our practices of prayer, meditation, singing spiritual songs, and reading scripture are all intended to help us to grow towards peace, to the point of experiencing the peace of Christ ourselves. As we grow spiritually, we often gain a more peaceful and loving mind, even when our surroundings are not necessarily all that peaceful. Yet the minds of most Americans are everything but peaceful. Most of us are never taught the importance of managing our thought processes, and therefore our minds can literally be out of control. Too many of us have a storm raging inside of our heads. Sometimes anger, sometimes a sense of unease, of anxiety, overall negativity that makes peacefulness and quiet almost unimaginable. And that storm in our heads may or may not be noticed by the outside world. In some cases, it's not noticed until our mental storm results in an outburst of some type of unhelpful anger, or freezes us in worry or anxiety, or results in other unloving behaviors. And this is not intended as criticism. It's just being honest. Honest that this is an area for potential improvement in almost everybody's spiritual life, certainly in mine. Certainly this is an area that needs my attention every day. We have more power over our own thoughts than we do just about anything else. And so it's kind of bizarre how little attention we pay to this important area. Negative thought processes yield negative results. Positive thought process yield positive. Very simple, very basic, right? Easy to understand. But yet most people don't know which mental processes help us versus the mental processes or practices that cause damage to us, that rob us of our peace. The Bible talks about our mental thought processes a lot, although we don't always look at it that way. At the most basic level, loving one's neighbor begins inside of us, in our heads and in our hearts. And it's a way of looking at the world, a way that is appreciative. If we're unable to perceive the world in loving ways, it's very difficult to be at peace. These two things are connected. If we do not experience the love of God, if we do not experience the love of reality, if we don't feel as if we are loved, we're unlikely to be at peace. If our minds are constantly focused on negative things, on violence, on things that cause unhelpful anger, on bad news, what happens? We'll be negative, angry, anxious all the time, or more often than we want to be. And we're going to respond to others that way, rather than with love and with peace. Today's passage from Ephesians teaches us about character, about proper thinking, and about anger in some interesting ways by using our relationship with others as a teaching tool and as a goal to work towards. Today's scripture comes from a letter attributed to the Apostle Paul, who had experienced the peace of Christ. Right? Paul had stood in the presence of Christ, and he's trying to explain how that impacted him. Paul's experience of Christ changed him. It improved his relationships with others, and it made him a far more loving and more peaceful person. Not a perfect person, but a more loving and peaceful person than what he was prior to his encounter with Jesus Christ. When we don't have good relationships with those around us, peace and tranquility are hard to come by, and vice versa. It's hard to have good relationships with others when there's a storm raging inside of our head. A peaceful and loving mind will result in good, honest relationships with others, and vice versa. Good, honest relationships with others will lead to a more peaceful mind. To describe this reality, today's scripture starts off with the imperative to be honest, to be truthful with each other. And the reason we should be truthful with each other is because we are members one of another, that we should view others as part of ourselves. Paul experienced this connection as a direct result of his encounter with Christ. When Paul says that we are one body, he's talking about a level of perception, a level of understanding, an experience of life that results from seeing and experiencing others as a part of ourselves in loving and peaceful ways, as opposed to, or less helpful perceptions, are normal perceptions that tend to be self-focused, self-absorbed, or mental attitudes that result in us seeing other people as either above us or below us, rather than as part of us. Our tendency to see others as above us or below us, as seeing others as ahead of us, as doing better than us, or worse than us, is the result of a judgmental view of reality, of a judgmental perception of life, something Jesus Christ himself frequently discouraged. Other people are part of us by design. So our mental peace is connected to our peace for others, and we can't have peace for others when we're constantly have this judgmental mindset where we see other people as above us or below us rather than part of us. Therefore, Paul starts off with honesty. Speak the truth to your neighbor, he says. Well, we should talk about that a little bit. What does that mean? Speak the truth. Does being honest, does speaking the truth mean I'm supposed to give you my appraisal of everything that you do? Does being honest mean sharing every judgment I've drawn about you with you? When Jesus specifically told us not to judge. And not to judge, I mean not to appraise others, right? That's not what this is about. Because as we read on, we see that while being honest is held in high regard, being honest is not enough when it comes to our relationships with others. When we think we're just being real with others by sharing what we think of them, for example, by sharing how we think they measure up to our biblical yardstick, perhaps, it's worth hitting the pause button and thinking about what might be going on in our own head at that point. The Bible teaches us, Jesus taught us not to judge others, yet it's so deeply wired into us. And there's such deep spiritual meaning behind this teaching of Jesus Christ. It is so vital to understand and to live out if you're going to live a loving and peaceful life. It's one thing to be honest and to share our observations, but judgments are not the same as observations. The Bible teaches us to keep our judgments to ourselves, or better yet, avoid judgments in our heads to begin with, or know when we're making a judgment in our heads and stop ourselves right there. When we speak with one another, truth is just the beginning. Avoiding judgments and evaluations of others is also important. Our judgments are inherently subjective. They're evaluations that we make, not objective truth. And in most situations, they're not actually helpful. They don't have a useful function in a lot of cases. So while today's scripture starts off with the importance of being honest, it qualifies that instruction when it comes to speaking to others. It says that only speak those things that are both needed and those things that build up community. That's it. Those things that are needed, those things that build up community. Only speak those truths that are helpful and needed. Avoid extra words, avoid judgments. Speaking truth may not be sufficient reason to speak at all. If that truth is not needed, if that truth is not helpful, or if that truth is rooted in your own judgments. This is a pretty high bar for speech. I'm not saying we're all going to be able to achieve this. It's the goal. It's the results that today's text are calling us to. So before we speak the truth, we consider the big picture. Is it true as in an observation that actually happened, that's objective and not a judgment? Is it needed? Is it helpful? And then measure your words and consider whether they might just be best to keep to yourself. If we put our truth to words in moments of anger, we have to be really careful. Words rooted in anger are rarely helpful and are often a sign that someone is mentally fixated on a judgment rather than on an observation, or in other words, rather than what's really going on in that moment. The Bible teaches us not to judge other people, and for good reason. And I've talked about this in the past, although maybe it's been a little while, about the difference between making a judgment versus making a non-judgmental observation of a situation. Judging others starts out as a bad mental habit that we learn very early in life, and then for most of us, it stays with us. But it's a terrible way to communicate. Instead of communicating our judgments, it's much better practice to communicate our observations, to communicate what we see, feel, hear, or smell, or what we're receiving through our senses. Such observations are not positive or negative, right? They don't put other people down or raise them up. Our judgments, on the other hand, are positive and negative, right? And they're inherently subjective conclusions that are loaded with baggage. And this applies to how we think about ourselves, maybe even more so than how we think about others. We judge ourselves like this. If you find yourself judging other people, I pretty much assure you, you're doing the same thing to yourself. And who pays the price? Yeah, we do. It's important to pay attention to these mental processes, to know how to think and talk, because they have a big impact on how we feel and how we act. And a lot of times when we lose our peace, when we're angry, look at your thought processes and ask yourself, are you being judgmental? Taking steps to avoid thinking and talking in terms of judgment can reduce feelings of negativity and anger significantly, improving both our peace and our ability to be an expression of love. Anger grows like a cancer if we're not careful, both within ourselves individually and across the community. Anger spreads when we engage others with judgmental thinking and hurtful words, and it robs us of our peace of mind and damages our relationships. But we have to be careful here. We can't ignore our anger. It's part of who we are. It's part of what it means to be human. We're going to be angry sometimes, right? But there's real dangers if we ignore that anger, if we don't deal with it properly. We can become wound up like a spring, or worse, it can leave us cold and bitter, unable to enjoy life. When we ignore or deny our anger, we usually pay a price. So when we feel angry, what are we supposed to do about it? In today's scripture, Paul says it's okay to be angry, or that some anger can be justified, but he cautions us. He says, do not say or do things out of anger that hurt. He says, be angry, but don't sin. Don't make room for the devil, he says, by reacting to anger with judgment, with violence, with disconnection. Yet it can be difficult to be at peace when we are angry, even if the anger is justified. So Paul goes on and he says, all right, fine. Be angry, but don't let that be an excuse for you being a bad person, and don't let the sun go down on your anger. Have you heard that saying before? Don't let the sun go down. This is from today's scripture reading. It's best if we don't stew in our anger all night and the next day and the day after that. Right? If we're to maintain our peace, it's best to resolve our anger quickly. Emotional and mental peace requires a good night's sleep, a peaceful night's sleep. Peace requires that we process our anger, that we resolve it, that we don't allow our anger to fester and to grow. Because when our anger grows, it's likely because our judgments are growing. Dealing with anger is complicated. I don't want to try to make this sound easy. It might sound easy. It's not. And this passage from Ephesians tells us what to do, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how. So how do we grow towards peace? Do you have things that you do when you need to feel peace? Places you go, music you play? And what other information can we glean from the Bible and from Christ's teachings? Well, we know that more spiritually mature people tend to have better control over their anger, while those who are less spiritually mature are more prone to rage. So advancing our spiritual development is one of the best ways to work on our level of peace. Spiritual practices are intended to take our minds, our fixations, our anger away from our judgments, and instead spend time as a process focusing on something more positive, on something that's more helpful. To focus on higher spiritual concepts such as love and connection instead of judgment or any of the thought processes that we have that are bad or hurtful. Spiritual practices include things like meditation, prayer, music, reading the Bible, participating in worship services, talking to others when you're at that boiling point can sometimes also be hugely important. And it's why we're a community, so we can be here for each other. These practices and our connection to one another strengthen our spiritual development, teaching us ideally to trust in God in deeper and more meaningful ways. Trusting God so deep that we don't worry so much. To trust God so deeply that we don't judge others. We don't judge ourselves. When we are engaged in prayer or engaged in reading Scripture, it's harder to stay fixated on anger. It's harder to stay fixated on ourselves and on our judgments of others and our judgments of ourselves. And if we find ourselves dealing with a lot of anger, we need to take time to reflect in ways that diffuse and resolve it, in ways that pick it apart. Why am I angry? Oh, that's a judgment. It almost always is. That judgment isn't true. Why isn't it true? Don't fixate on it, resolve it. And be careful that you're not just justifying your anger either. You're responsible. We're responsible for our anger. Right? Justifying it isn't going to help. Justifying our anger is what we do naturally, and it can make us feel better in the short run. But the problem is that justifying our anger does not necessarily lead to spiritual growth, and too often leads to justifying our judgments. So instead of seeking to justify our anger, seek for the roots of that anger or other damaging thought processes and bring those roots to God in prayer. Remember, our spiritual development is not necessarily going to be smooth or consistent. You might do really well for this for a while and not so much. That's normal. In every one of us, there's some aspects of each of us that are very spiritually advanced. Every one of us here have very advanced spiritual aspects of ourselves, and we have aspects of ourselves that not so much, right? We're all mixed. Our challenge is to reduce our problematic thought processes while at the same time feeding our more helpful spiritual virtues. One approach to spiritual development that I recommend, I've mentioned before, and is a deep practice in the our spiritual tradition, is the use of morning and evening prayer time. Start your day in the morning in meditation and prayer, about 10 minutes, and then end your day the same way. This will build your spiritual and mental muscles, your ability to deal with stress, frustration, and anger in your life. But you have to stay after it. You can't just do it once or twice. Every day. You'll see results after a month maybe. You have to stay after it. Then before you go to bed each night, review your day. Looking for anger, looking for times that you were judgmental. When other people were judgmental about you, don't be hard on them, right? Be forgiving, but know that that's going on. You're trying to seek out those things that you're fixated on and let go of them and give them to God. In addition to gaining deeper trust and fuller relationships with God, spiritual practices change our brain structure in remarkable and measurable ways. We sometimes like to pretend that our mistakes, that our points of conflict never happened, but that's not helpful either. Denial is not what the Bible teaches. Don't hide from the worst part of your day. Don't regret them. Listen to them. Accept them as part of who you are and where you're at right now. With a forgiving heart. Reflect carefully on your emotions. Consider your own motives. Your words, the words of others, and then let go. That's what forgiveness is about. Forgiveness is part of the pathway towards love and peace. It may be helpful to keep a private journal of your thoughts as a way to organize and better understand your own mind and your own tendency to draw and make judgments, and to learn how to tell the judgment from an observation. Expect your anger and other emotions to be self-centered. That's pretty typical. And be very skeptical if you think you're already too spiritually advanced to benefit from a careful review of your frustrations and lack of peace. After you meditate on them, after you offer your fixations, offer your anger and your negative judgments to God, and seek to transform those areas of your life that are causing pain for yourself and others, because that's what this stuff does. When we're robbed of our peace, it can make life very difficult, or worse, you know. The simple act of intentionally seeking to resolve our anger and our frustration when motivated by Christ is very helpful. It can assist us in moving past ourselves to greater truths and a fuller experience of life and a more fulfilling experience of emotional and mental peace. And practically speaking, it's best when done at least twice every day, once in the morning and once at night, maybe 10 minutes. If you had a really frustrating day, maybe it takes a little longer that night. If you do this kind of reflection before bed as a way to resolve your anger before you sleep, you'll be acting in accordance with today's scriptural passage. Night meditation is usually about reflection and learning from your day. Morning meditation is about preparing yourself, strengthening your brain, guarding yourself against judgment for the day ahead. Then during the day, measure your words, speak only what's needed, speak only what builds up community, speak only what assists in helping others to experience life as an expression of love. And don't speak out of judgment. Don't speak out of anger. If you can't speak to somebody without getting angry, that's an indication of work you need to do, probably more so than the person that you're angry with. Spiritual growth is an intentional process. Making peace takes effort, careful thinking, controlled, and these are abilities that you have to develop. Don't expect to be good at it right away. But it's worth the effort. For as Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Engaging in this process allows us to be peacemakers. And let's start that process within ourselves.